Oh, actually, I'll do
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Discovery Channel. This is Tom O'Connor, or as I'm known around town, Santa Claus. Um, we're coming up. We're counting down the days to Christmas, and looking forward to it. I'm really happy to have Dave Lewis with me here. Many of you may have seen the announcement a week or so ago that Dave has joined Nextpoint, renowned as a data scientist and expert in the world of AI. I know you cringe when I say that, Dave. Nobody wants to be called an expert in AI because we're still trying to figure out what it all means. But thanks for joining me. That's really where I wanted to go, is to get some of your thoughts on the state of AI, the state of the profession, if you will. And maybe before we do that, though, you could just give the people who don't know you, maybe give them a quick synopsis of your background, what you did before you joined Nextpoint in the last few weeks.
yeah, and thanks for having me on, Tom.
Oh, my pleasure. Great to see you.
So, yeah, so good to see you again too. Uh, and I'll try to stay on the good list for Christmas. Yeah, so I'm a computer scientist, not an attorney. Started out my career at Bell Labs. I've worked in machine learning and search and generally text analytics my whole career. Um, have was at AT&T and then was at my own consulting company for 16 years. Designing text analytics software, doing data analyses, things like that. And
Right.
like a lot of people, Jason Barron was my gateway drug. I had been involved in organizing evaluations of information retrieval technology for the National Institute of Standards. And Jason came to NIST and said, "Hey, there's this e-discovery stuff we really need help on." And so Jason and I and Doug Ord organized the first Trek legal track, and
Yep.
and that was
Yep.
sort of how I got into discovery. It's more and more of my consulting ended up being for e-discovery companies, and doing expert witness work, and then eventually I went full time at Brainspace, ran their AI team for 6 years, and they were eventually acquired by Reveal.
Yep.
Uh, and then I left and started a consulting company, Red Grape Data, with some friends. We sold that recently to Elevate, which
Ah.
is a larger e-discovery litigation technology services company.
Yep.
Uh, and so after that, I decided I was interested in going back to the software world. I'd known Rocky, the CEO of Nextpoint, for a long time. He was actually my second consulting client in e-discovery back like more than 10 years ago. And have always been impressed by the company. And so we talked about what you might do there in AI, and I sort of came on to run the AI efforts, and I've been there about a week and a half. So
Good.
still
Good.
getting
Well,
under.
excited to have you. I do some ad hoc consulting with them. We've worked on a couple of projects, and we're
We did
actually trying to put together a little.
finding legal tech labs earlier this.
Yeah, yeah, and we're trying to work on something about AI to do as an appendix to the book that we have. Um, and so I was excited to see you on board to have somebody who's got a little dose of reality uh, about this whole thing. As I said to you before we got started here, I'm just really been distressed about the hype over AI, the lack of definition, um, and and of course I have blinders. I'm really interested in the e-discovery application. There's a whole host of other things that are going on out there with AI uses that I think are fabulous, and of great help to attorneys. Um, but unfortunately, in the e-discovery world, we seem to have a lot of fast talking and not a whole lot of definition. Maura Grossman wrote an article, I think it's a little over a year now, uh, where she called it the Wild West medicine show of legal technology. That everybody's got their solution. They got their thing. Don't bother to ask me what's in the bottle. Just trust me, it works really well. So, what's your take? I mean, is that just natural at the beginning of a new technology that we're getting a lot of people jumping into it, and that's going to play out? You have a sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, both good and bad aspects to being, early and, I think we're particularly early in e-discovery. I mean, the generative AI technology has been maturing over the past 10 years or so. I think, Chat GPT got a much broader audience for that, but there really has been more like a decade of kind of growth of that technology and some very compelling applications.
Right,
Um, so, I mean, you get good and bad things at the beginning of the cycle on the technology. You get people trying out a lot of different things, which is great. And then you also get a ton of money flowing in, and not all of it's smart money. And people can get away with, you know, saying things and doing things that really don't make a lot of sense. And eventually the spigot shuts off. And like any other technology, it's going to have to prove its ROI. And we'll see. I mean, one of the reasons I'm glad to be at Nextpoint is, I in my career in legal technology, I have mostly been involved in technology assisted review and search,
right,
sort of middle of the EDRM style. And one nice thing about Nextpoint is they kind of span the EDRM. They've got a very strong presence in trial presentation and
yep,
things like that. And so that's kind of an exciting area. And I think particularly some of the generative capabilities for summarization and question answering are potentially particularly um, effective at those later parts of the EDRM, because there you've got a sort of a higher dense, you got a smaller amount of higher quality information. And so you don't have some of the same challenges with like per doc costs that you have at the review stage or the ECA stage.
right. And the one area, and I'm not sure it's being utilized to the best of that capability, would be early on is some of the ability to try to find things that are not just relevant but privilege review, which we have to do at the onset. It would seem to me we could use AI for that if used effectively, and it would be very helpful at the front end to then try to cut down on some of the mass amount of information that's just not really useful. I like your point about document summaries, though. We talked a little bit about a company that released a nice little blurb this week about their ability to do depot summaries increasingly fast, and then we have the trade off. You know, we're gonna let the machines do something, and how much human review do we have to make sure that it's accurate? Um, and what's the cost analysis there? We were talking about how it reminded us of some of the early days of other technologies, um, like transcript technologies, voice transcriptions, um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even
So I mean, I think deposition, I mean, and we've got a project on deposition summarization as well going on at Next Point.
good,
Uh, I think the but one of the things we look at, and I chatted with you earlier about the experience with machine translation, which is for decades really, people argued that, well, okay, so the machine translation is not good enough, but it'll get good enough that we can pay a translator to do a little bit of cleanup on it. And what happened historically was, at the point that translations got good enough that it would actually be cost effective to pay a person to clean up the translation, they just stopped paying people. And they said, okay, well, just good enough, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
so there was never a point in that technology curve where it made sense to have people clean up AI output. You either had human translation or you had AI output. I mean, human translation used all sorts of automation, translation reuse banks and whatnot. It's just that it didn't use AI, right?
right,
So I think this is, I was, I've repeated that example many times, but I think it emphasizes the need to look at the total cost of generating the product or accomplishing the task or whatever. And so, one of the things, that I'm very focused on with our summarization project is, okay, how much work is it going to be? Is this good enough? And can we give reliability cues that minimize the amount of human checking that needs to be done so
Right.
that you really are saving people total cost there? And that's just, that's kind of the thing I've always been interested. Part of what got me into e-discovery is I'm very interested in these systems that have elements of AI and elements of human intellectual effort. Um, but it's too easy to just say that human beings are going to be the net that captures AI errors because it may not actually be cost effective to do that.
To
And and
do
and
that.
that's
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting. You have to take a kind of systems approach to looking at the whole workflow.
And likewise in privilege review, which depends much more on analytics and an analytic style review, a human analytics, um, to do an analysis of what's being talked about. And is this really so? We've had there's been some great examples. AI goes through and pulls every SIG file known to man and says, oh, this document is privileged because the attorney's name was in there.
Hey,
And then when you
we probably are past that one now. Yeah.
if it's used properly, and that comes back to what I think is the real problem is how do you, at what point do you have skilled people at the front end making the right decision? There was a classic example just a couple of weeks ago. We were doing the Gail O'Connor Spirit Award, which is something that a bunch of people in the industry have done for a few years now. And one of the nominees said, I knew Gail and I missed her, but I thought it might be good to do a quick check to see who has anybody else passed in our world, and just give them a nod of the head too. And so he used ChatGPT to do a query that said, "Tell me e-discovery consultants who have died in the last, I don't know, year, 2 years, whatever." And the query response came back with 5 names. The 5 names were Craig Ball, George Sosha, Shira Shinlin. I forget who the fourth one was. The fourth one, and me. I was the fifth name on the list. The point is, it came back with 5 people who were all alive. And so then it came down to, how good was the query? It wasn't that the AI is bad or good. It's, it's just like, the automobile. How good is the driver? You're only as good as the driver.
Yeah, well, I suspect Judge Schindlin may not be happy being called an e-discovery consultant either.
Well, that's the other thing is it came up with, how did you come up with these names? Like, well, what was the thing? And it made a couple of other glaring errors. Like it made note of in talking about George Socha, it did not mention that he had started the EDRM, and but it gave him credit for having worked with several well-known companies, including BIA, which George never worked for.
Yeah.
He did work for BDO. So again, before we even think about reviewing what the results are, how do we know that the prompt? And I know Maura's been taking a look at prompt engineering for a while now, saying, first of all, you have to start off with the right questions, and make sure you know what you're doing to try to get the right answers up front. And you can't just kind of let the machines loose.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think people are starting to realize this. There is it's a very powerful underlying technologies with the LLMs, but it's a pretty awkward way to program a computer if you think of it that way, right? I
Oh
mean,
yeah, right.
programming, you're effective because if you think about what are you doing with a prompt, you're effectively programming a computer with English, right? And English is ambiguous and confusing and metaphorical and stuff like that. And so, I tend not to view the LLM as a solution to a particular task or a way to accomplish a particular task. It is an underlying fundamental technology which is going to have to be part of some sort of engineered system. And I always tell people, I mean, any sort of system that's using LLMs is probably like 95% plain old software engineering, which you're doing to, and I think the new part is then, there is this, prompt engineering notion where part of what you're doing is probing a model in particular ways, but you still have to build a whole software system around that.
Right.
I think
Right.
part of what Chat GPT did, which was sort of diabolical, was that by putting a conversational interface around an LLM, it encouraged people to think about, interaction with an LLM, that was the natural way to interact with an LLM. You could easily imagine a different universe where there were no conversational interfaces on LLMs, and you had something that was much more like, you access them through API, which really you are doing effectively. You're building any real system, you're going to access it through an API. You're going to do all the sort of conventional software engineering and testing and things like that. Um, and in fact, that's what was happening before ChatGPT. People were building Gen AI systems before
Right.
ChatGPT.
Right.
It's just ChatGPT got this thing in people's heads that using Gen AI was all about having a conversation.
We can
And
just
that's
have a simple little chat. Just the name alone, Chat
right.
GBT. Like, yeah.
And for QA, for question answering, that's a fairly natural mode of interaction. Um, I think, I mean, the example you posed of what really is a search task, right? I mean, you don't really want to have a conversation with Chat GPT to find out who died. You want a search system that's going to bring you back authoritative references with good pedigree and point you to them before you, sort of get up and say that somebody died or cancel their, you know, life insurance or something or pay out on their
Right.
life.
Right.
It's just it's just I do feel like there's been um it's unfortunate, and then even worse than fortunately I think we're past some of this. Some of the hysteria we had more, year and a half or so ago, that and it's not gone. There's still people out in Silicon Valley who are hysterical, and AI is going to take over the world, and P doom and all this garbage. And I think that's very related to the fact that the conversational interface and the fluency of the responses really broke people's brains. And the thing was, we had never had to deal, as a species, we had never had to deal with artifacts that could generate fluent language but didn't know anything, didn't think, didn't reason, right?
Right.
And people try to talk themselves and play games and claim chain of thought and all this garbage that you're doing reasoning. There's no reasoning there. It's just spitting out from a probabilistic model. And the historical, there's an interesting historical analog here, which is if you go back to the early 19th century, when we first began to have just basic mechanical engineering, air pumps, fluid pumps, things like that. There was this fad for what were called automata. What we would now think of, you would see at Disneyland, robotic Abe Lincoln
Yeah.
or what.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they created these things for the first time, like, a bunny that its ears would move and it would look like it was breathing a little or something like. And for us now, you wouldn't spend 5 cents at a dollar store for something like that. We have toys that are so much better. But it broke people's brains. Like, philosophers were saying, is this alive? What is the meaning of life and things like that? And because the human species had never encountered artifacts like that before.
Right.
And I think, in 5 years, we will look back at the reactions that people had to Chat GPT and just sort of laugh at it, because we'll all have gotten acculturated to the fact that you can have artifacts that generate fluent language, but don't think, don't reason, don't know anything, right?
It's really interesting if you think about it. We as humans spend the first 12 to 15 years of our lives developing that skill, how to
Right.
use a language, and interact with each other, ask a question, get a right response, evaluate the response, you
Right.
know, have a
What,
conversation.
you know, what, I'm a little kid, what can I expect from an adult? What can I expect from another kid? What can I expect from Fido? What can I expect from, a door, and we underappreciate that, how much work a child is doing, and how
Right.
much actual thinking and experience forming and whatnot is going on there. Uh,
But you just mentioned 5 years from now. Do you think is that what the learning curve is going to be? Is it going to take us 5 years for this to all settle down?
Well, it's
And
settled down somewhat already. I was just struck at, I mean, you look back year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and there were perfectly serious people saying, half of lawyers are going to lose their jobs,
oh yeah, yeah,
legal tech, that even this, early this year, nobody's worried about losing their jobs. Everybody understands that this is going to be a assistive technology. I mean, there's been a lot of stuff in the media recently about, how few of these, POCs are paying off, and in particular, and I can't remember who was a blogger or somebody was talking about this. I saw a really good observation that the difference, that there's a much bigger jump from going from a Gen AI POC to a Gen AI application than people are used to for POCs. That Gen AI POCs can be extremely misleading, right? Because again, this sort of thing, wow, it's putting out this amazingly fluent stuff and whatnot. It's, whatever, it's generating something that looks a lot like a contract, or it's generating these summaries or answering these questions, and it looks great in a POC. And of course, many of these POCs are like 5 lines of Python around, an OpenAI API, right?
right,
There's almost nothing there, so you can put it up really quickly, right? But then when you go to application, okay, now somebody's asking, what's this going to cost? What's the human cleanup going to cost? How much is this really going to save us money and whatnot? And the again, the fluency of the POC, the fact that it looks great, um, tells you almost nothing about whether it's going to make you money, right?
right.
And
And trial lawyers should know that, right? Trial lawyers, more than anybody else, I think, in our profession, should know fluency does not
yes,
equate to accuracy.
yeah, no,
I can
that's a
have a
really good
very
point.
good sounding presentation and an argument, and it could be complete kerfuffle.
Yeah, I
Right.
think it's interesting. I think and I think that would be a good argument, that legal tech is climbing, and that's the intuition I've had. Legal tech's climbing this curve a little faster than some other parts of the economy,
Interesting.
because even though attorneys maybe didn't initially, um, have more skepticism than other professions around, or they had the ability to be impressed by fluency like anybody else. But attorneys also in their day-to-day work, as you say, are used to people lying, documents being wrong and whatnot, and the fact that you have to interrogate these things, you have to look at pedigree and whatnot. And I do think what we're seeing is that attorneys are bringing that mindset now to AI a little more.
It's coming to play. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So
much.
that's a great point. So what do you tell people if you have client if you're talking to a law firm, um, and I get this a lot. I was helping a firm do an AI policy and make some decisions about a product to use, et cetera, et cetera. I get that question a lot, especially from smaller mid-sized firms. The ILTA definition of small is 100 or less. So
Okay.
people who don't necessarily have a large, robust IT department. I mean, the good thing about corporations and very large firms is that they have technically savvy people on board. Small and medium firms, not necessarily so. So, what do you tell them? How do they start making the decisions here on what to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I mean, obviously, I've been on the services side the past 2.5 years, so we did
Yeah,
consult with law firms on these things. And I guess what I say a lot of boring things, right? I say, you need to evaluate Gen AI technologies the same way you would evaluate, the dullest technology you could imagine bringing in. I mean, you know, think about Gen AI, the way you think about bringing in billing software. Not to slam billing software people, because some of that's
no, no,
pretty,
no.
but
That's
the when you
not
think
something that people get wildly excited about.
Yeah. And you gotta think, okay, what are we actually paying for people to do this right now? What are the steps that they execute? What are which of those steps could a Gen AI system replace or speed up? What's it gonna cost? And it's like any automation project. With I think with the additional complexity that the output is less predictable, and you've got this notion of cleanup time or checking, either cleanup or checking results so that it's suitable, and you just have to build all that into the analysis.
Yeah,
The other piece is just, and this is not a pure cost issue, but it is relevant in practice, is that um, people hate cleaning up machine output. um,
right. It's
there's one more thing I want to say about that, which is also important, which is you have to be really careful to understand all the types of value that come out of a project. So I'm pretty bullish on generative AI um, aiding with contract synthesis for it.
right.
Now, partly because we've already seen a lot of success over the years with contract banks and partial reuse of contract, things like that. So so one thing I'd say is I think Gen AI is an additional increment on that. It's also worth noting that lots and lots of law firms don't even have the basic technologies we've known how to do for 20 years in place
For
for
document assembly. Yeah, yeah.
document reuse and templating and things like that.
Yes.
So
Great
I think,
point.
yeah, the Gen AI will help a little bit on that. But the piece that I think that's sometimes underappreciated here is that if I'm a client and I go to a law firm and I'm paying them to draft, a contract with vendors or something like that, an important one, something like that. I'm not just paying them for that document, right? 7,000 words in a row that comes out of that. Well, the other thing I'm getting out of that is they understand more about my business, right? So it's in their head. I'm paying for that particular law firm to know more about my business. And then when I come to them the next time, they're going to be more efficient or
That's
they
right.
handle
They're an
it.
advisor. It's not a specific task. You're right.
Yeah.
It's the whole picture.
The value is both the document and the change in the attorney's head. And if the introduction of generative AI means that law firm now doesn't understand me as well as it would have been, as it would have if somebody had sort of, talked to me
Yeah,
and wrote the contract by hand, and they had to think about it me as as they were writing the contract and whatnot, then something's lost there too.
yeah.
Uh, and that's, again, it's why I keep coming back to this kind of systems level analysis here of,
I know. I think that's a great point. We're getting we're getting too wrapped up in the one piece of output,
yeah,
the one task, if you will, and yeah, and losing sight of what is it that we as lawyers are doing overall.
yep,
What's our goal here? The other last point I want to mention, where I see, which is really interesting, and I don't know how it's going to play out, is the absorption of AI technology into operating systems or larger pieces of software that we don't necessarily know about. I saw a fascinating a couple of years ago. Bill Gates was here in town for the Tulane Book Show. It's an annual big people come in and talk about books. Gates walks in with he's always carrying a like a beach bag with 8 or 10 books in it. He likes to read real books, right? He doesn't use a tablet. And he has a list every summer. Here's the 20 books you should read this summer, blah, blah, blah. So, and of course, he's talking about that, and he's talking about books and, their effect on us. And, but somebody has to ask him about AI. It was inevitable. And he said, look, obviously we're a little bullish on AI. This is 2 years ago. We're investing in AI. My people are all over it. And then by his people, I'm sure he means the millions of minions worldwide who are working on systems for him. He said, but my attitude is I don't want you to come in and hit the AI button. He said, just think of it like spell check. He said, when you're doing spell check, you can you can turn it on at the end of writing your document and tell it to go through and check. But much like on your phone, it's correcting things as it goes. It's just working. And it's doing that. And he said, I think we're going to see more and more of that. And I'm thinking, that's what I'm seeing with Copilot. It's starting to be just kind of built in as part of the system. And that seems to me that goes to what you're talking about. It's part of a process. It's part of how you work. It's not a specific thing that you want to. Oh, I know how to do AI. Well, it's like, well, I know how to use a phone. Congratulations. It's just the way we work on. Much like we've gone from storing data on our hard drive or our network to the cloud, which 10 years ago attorneys were, they were aghast at putting something out into the internet someplace that we don't even know where it is. Now it's just commonplace. So I wonder how much of that is going to happen too. And we're just used to doing these things as part of the way we work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. I mean, I think that's the state you want to get into. You want good, and I think maybe a thing I didn't emphasize so much earlier is it's just UI and UX design just play a gigantic role here.
Right.
You shouldn't be pressing a button that says AI, right? And it should
Right.
be built into. I think that also is sort of, why I'm a little cynical or about, this buzzword that goes, this phrase that goes around. AI is not going to take your job. Somebody who uses AI is going to take your job, and that's pretty silly because if the AI is being used effectively, then you're not an AI user. You're just doing your job like anybody else, and
Yeah.
the tool is available to everybody if it's actually integrated well. So, I'm very, there's some funny cartoons out there which are a little untoward, so I won't point to them about, I think there's one where some guy shows up for a date, and he says to this girl's father, the father says, "Hey, I've heard you're an AI engineer," and the kid says, "Yes, I'm a prompt engineer," and the father says, "Get the F out of my house," and it's the thing. I mean, prompt engineering is not going to be a thing in the long run, right? I mean, all of that is going to be sort of buried within systems that have some sort of like interesting workflow. Right. And you may be entering inputs and interacting with the system in a fashion that's generating a prompt, but there's not going to be a job category that's prompt engineering.
Right. So last but not least, are we going to see significant price degradation? I don't want to say commoditization, but the part of the thrill of AI is that people are premium pricing it too. You want to use and I understand part of that is their licensing systems from larger companies, so they have to pay a fee. But are we going to see that settle down, come down?
I mean, I think we're going to see it settle down just in the sense that that happens with every new technology.
Yeah,
There's, you know, injudicious buyers out there right now, just like there's injudicious investors. But that's all calming down pretty quickly.
yeah,
Uh, yeah, and I mean, it'll come down to what's the actual value here. I mean, I will say the underlying costs of generative AI are declining quickly and probably will continue to decline quickly for some number of years. It's just, this is a pretty young technology, and right now, we burn a lot of compute because we, haven't worked out what the best algorithms are, what the best way to use this
right.
technology.
Yeah, we
Uh,
forget how new this is in terms of what we're using, not the underlying technology. Of course, machine learning has
yeah.
been with us in numerous iterations, but but this,
The scale of the foundation, what people call like the foundation models, large language models and image models and things like that, that is all pretty new that we've operated at that scale. But
yeah,
there is, obviously very intense computer science research to speed up the algorithms and introduce more approximations and things like that. So, the that's why, while I think right now it's, I think there's questions about the cost benefit trade-off of, say, Gen AI for review. I think there'll be less question about that in a couple of years, because as the prices are going to drop pretty quickly.
right, right.
And in the ability to do premium pricing then will also, drop there, and it'll become more of a routine
Yeah.
technology.
I told you before we started recording when we were talking earlier, it reminds me an awful lot of what went on with OCR in the early days. There was this great technology, but it wasn't, it was like 75, 80% accurate, and it was really expensive per page. And it just got better, as all technology does. It got better and better to now. We don't even think about it.
Yep.
Right? I mean, it's just something that, yeah, we're still so much in the early stages of this that, um, so basically, what I always tell people about any software is, what is it you're trying to do? What's your goal here? You're trying to find some documents, trying to review documents, you're trying to find privileged documents, you're trying to, if you got a smoking gun, you're, in the defense world, where I told you I do some work with the federal defenders, they always laugh when they get technology um, demonstrations, because somebody says, well, we can do this and we can do that, and we can do all this thing, and a good defense attorney will go, look at the first thing I want to do when I see a bunch of documents is, how many times is my guy's name mentioned?
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
right.
That's my number one concern. You got 10,000 pieces of paper here and all these voice recordings and wiretaps, and how many times do they say Sammy Smith?
Yep.
That's what I want to know. And that's going to
Yeah.
tell me what to do next.
Yeah, but I mean, that's one where, I mean, I think a good candidate for the thing that the technology that has really sort of made the big step change is speech recognition. So we
Yes,
just, speech recognition, was pretty bad for decades, except
yes,
in very, very limited, good microphone, small vocabulary, whatnot.
yes,
And now we really have pretty much unconstrained high quality speech recognition,
yes.
on your phone, right? Which does a pretty good job of transcribing, a voice message, it said. So I presume that, I'm not familiar with what goes on in criminal cases, but I hope those public defenders, are have access to speech recognition they can run on the wiretaps and things, right? That would
Well,
be
it's getting better for them. The other problem there, of course, is budgeting. If it's a public defender, or at the federal level, a federal defender, they have limited resources, which are often touched by the court. So it can be problematic for that. Not even a technology reason, just a scope
yeah,
reason. And the January 6th insurrection cases were a great example. Tons and tons of data off of cell phones that included text messages, voice messages, video with voice.
yeah.
Whole new types of technology that, oh my goodness, how are we going to deal with that? So there's always something new. Well, Dave, I really want to thank you for taking some time to talk with me. I'm I'm excited about maybe working on some projects after the first of the year over at Nextpoint. See if we can get something going over there. It's an exciting time to be involved in our profession. I think this intersection between the technology and the law um, is really somewhat unique. In the past, we've had things like the telegraph, the telephone, the fax machine, OCR. This is far more encompassing than that. It goes across a lot of boundaries. So, um, thanks again for your time, and always great talking to you. Look for you at Legal Tech New York, maybe, or whatever they call it now.
Yeah. No, it's super good talking with you, Tom. Thanks so much.
My pleasure, and have a great holiday season. Merry Christmas to you and the family.
Take care.
You bet.